Okay, today online we have Nick Rothwell. Nick Rothwell, as you could tell, I'm kind of plumbing my list of friends, and Nick is one of those. I've had a chance to work with him on a couple of music projects, but he's another one of these guys that I seem to have known forever. So, for example, the first time I lit up the early internet and was looking at news groups about electronic music, there was Nick. When I was working with people like Mike Metley, there was Nick. He was around for a long, long time before I was even. So that makes him sound like an old graybeard, but actually he's not. He's one of the most he's one of the most hyper literate, but also massively active person that I've interacted with. He's also one of these kind of like polymath guys where he knows a lot about all kinds of stuff, and so that makes him kind of interesting to have an interview with. Nick, hi, how are you?
Hi there. Good evening or good morning. It's morning for you, isn't it? Because you're way west of me by about 7 hours time zone wise.
Indeed, yeah. It's I'm still in my bathrobe doing the hard work.
Oh, there's an image I'm going to have to fight to get out of my mind.
Anyway, you can't unsee that one. Intro. Sure. What I'd like to do is have you just kind of start off, for those listeners who might not be familiar with your work, if you could just kind of give us an overview of your background and some of the work that you consider your most prominent work.
Oh, let's see. Well, it goes back many years, in fact, quite a few decades. I started off as a mathematician, actually, back in school and university, and I kind of flunked out of that because, well, I enjoyed all the pure math stuff, which involved drawing lots of interesting diagrams and, working with really bizarre pure mathematical concepts. The applied maths let me down, and by that time I'd started using computers, playing with them, so the maths kind of went by the wayside, and I eventually came out the other end with a PhD in computer science. I decided that I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life, I guess. And I started taking piano lessons whilst trying to get the PhD, which was not the wisest of pieces of time management. Got as far as doing electronica gigs, because I'm kind of a Berlin school electronica head at heart, I guess. Got a bit fed up with doing that because it was all about sound, and it was very hard to do shows that were kind of visually engaging as well. This is something we've been hearing for the last 20 years, but it was true when I started out as well. And then kind of got sidetracked into stuff that's going on in small theatres, and from there sidetracked into working with dance companies. And at the moment, well, I'll say at the moment, being a freelancer, it's hard to say what's coming up next, but certainly for the last year I've been working with some of the major companies and choreographers in the UK. So I've just finished a big project with Wayne McGregor, who runs Random Dance. He's based at Sadler's Wells, and he choreographs the Royal Ballet. Been working with a choreographer named Shobna Jaya Singh, who does stuff at the South Bank Centre. Kind of started out doing Kathakali, and now does a lot of kind of mathematically based dance work with a kind of an Indian choreographic content to it. And I'm just kind of floating around in that world of somebody who is literacy in software, doing collaborative projects based on digital video and digital sound with dance makers, and it's a great place to be.
Right. Now, you said that you're a freelancer. How long? I mean, I don't ever actually recall you working for a company. You've always been kind of a freelance programmer, artist. I mean, you've been doing that for a long, long time, right?
I actually started out with a day job. I guess that was when I finished the research fellowship, the computer science fellowship at Edinburgh, and moved into a day job just doing pretty dull software for a small company. And because I'm not a natural risk taker, I had to wait for them to kind of go bust and to be laid off before I could actually do anything interesting. And I kind of moved into another day job when I moved down to London to kind of follow the art scene. And again, I stuck with that until they went bust and I got laid off. And I've been kind of just about surviving freelancing ever since. So I seem to have a knack of maneuvering myself into a position where I've got to make a jump into doing something with an element of risk to it. And so far, it's kind of worked off. It's kind of worked out.
I see. Well, clearly, you never talked about your day jobs because you were hard at work making the companies go bust. Awesome.
You got it. Yes.
No, note to future potential employers: no, don't do it. But as I mentioned in my introduction, when I first got onto the internet and was like interested in diving into some of my interests, you were there. How was it that you were connected to the network that early?
Well, part of it, I think, was, like I say, having a research fellowship at Edinburgh, and the academic scene, certainly in the UK, was very well connected online. We had this thing called Janet and Super Janet, which was a really high-speed network, kind of running alongside what was still then, I guess, the tail end of the ARPANET before the internet came along properly. And we got our news feeds coming in through one piece of wire. It came in from Amsterdam, I think, and then into University of Kent, and then to the rest of the UK. And yeah, we were kind of connected. We had to write our emails with the main part at the beginning rather than the end, and it got kind of reversed as it went across the Atlantic. So I was Nick at uk.ac.ed.lfcs, and it got reversed when it went across to Europe and the US, and then got reversed back again by some horrible bits of software.
Oh, that's unreal. Well, it's funny because you say that, and I remember, again, when I first kind of lit up the net and got involved in news groups, when you interacted with people, you were basically routing your stuff directly to their machine. You would look at, their sort of like send to address, and about half of them actually had machine identifiers built right into the routing list. It was crazy.
Oh, you had a bank path. So, you go, I would be, LFCS, pling, name of my Sun workstation, pling, UKC, which would be Kent, pling, MCVAX would be the one in Amsterdam, pling,
right,
somewhere else. And you can actually follow these things like sipping a stone across water, across a pool. You can see it bouncing and splashing as it went along.
Right. So in those early days, you were interacting with a lot of people. I ran into you in the eMusical list, as well as some others. And you seem to already know a lot of the people on the list. How many of the people did you actually know before you met them on the internet?
Probably none. I think being an academic, we had those long lunch times, and that was all spent, with a sandwich in hand, sitting at a desk, just trawling news groups. And I kind of gravitated to the electronic music ones because in these days before the web, it was kind of hard to find out about what was going on, both in terms of the genre and in terms of the equipment that was available. And being in the UK, apart from some magazines, it was kind of very hard to get a sense of what the scene was. So I guess I gravitated towards something that was more global. And we had stuff coming in from the States, the likes of yourself, Mike Metley, Joe McMahon, all these people. We had some stuff coming in from Europe. We had a bunch of people in Holland, I think, at the time, because there was a kind of a Berlin schoolish electronic music scene there. And I think the reason I stuck around there was partly because of the great company, and partly because I was sick of being ripped off by UK music distributors who are charging twice as much money for selling things in the UK than you can buy them for in the States. So if you look back through the late 80s, you'll find most of my messages were, why the hell does such and such and such and such cost so much money in the UK when they can't even repair them here and they've got no idea how it works, when I could go to the States and buy one more cheaply. And eventually Mike Metley said, well, sod you, come on, fly to the US, come across here, buy some stuff and let's hang out. And the rest is history.
Yeah, truly. That is, in fact, one of the things that I remember is when I would hang with you at Mike's place. One of the big deals was kind of the shopping trip when we would go and give you the opportunity to buy stuff at a price that was like pennies on the dollar, apparently, to what you were able to get them in the UK.
I was going to say, these are days when there was such a big impedance mismatch between prices, whereas now, if you want to find out what something costs, you just Google it and straight away you get all the prices up, and the dealers can't play those games anymore. That kind of mismatch disparity is all but gone away, which is good. That's the way.
Right. Well, it's funny because to me, my recollection of the old days of music stores was that the guy running it looked like he could be a mobster, right? He was generally the short, angry, fat guy with a cigar, kind of like, you want that guitar, kid? And it wasn't necessarily, there wasn't much openness. And you could just tell that if you didn't watch your wallet, you were going to get ripped off. And the transparency of the internet certainly did break that down.
It took a while, yes, but eventually I think the companies realised, no, we can't put this thing, our price online, because, in the next window along in the browser, there's somebody looking at, Amazon or Sam Autosound or whatever, and they're seeing, the same number with a dollar sign in front rather than the pound sign, and, we can't keep this up.
Right. So now, you said that these different people that you met in the early days of the net, people were in the electronic music dance were actually coming from all over the place. You had a number of people that were sort of like Berlin school-oriented, which is, I guess, most easily identified to people as kind of a Tangerine Dream thing. You have the Dusseldorf people who were really influenced by Kraftwerk. You have, I guess, I don't know, what would you call the American people, the thing like Larry Fast and those people? What would that even be called? I don't know.
I'm not sure, because I've not listened to much of that stuff. It was hard to get back in the day, and, when I listen to this, I don't know, I'm not going to go on because I'll just make disparaging remarks about the American electronic music scene. I love the avant-garde, I love the experimental, performance artist side of things. Some of the full electronica, not so much, because I think, okay, opinionated klaxon goes off here. I think something like sound art based or timbrely based instrumental music with that kind of creative slant reflects a lot on the culture around you and the kind of place you grew up, the nationality, the culture of the country. And American electronic music is something I found very hard to read. It's very hard to kind of gain traction with the kind of emotional content of it. That's probably just me. But something about it I find hard to kind of get a grasp of.
Well, I think that, I do too, and I've never really understood it. And the closest I've ever come to trying to grasp onto something is that I always felt like as experimental as things were when they were coming out of that group of American artists, it still sounded to me like some form of movie soundtrack. There was the kind of the form it took was just something that didn't resonate, because I came from a background of song form, and so it was weird to me that this very soundtracky thing and like anthemic thing was happening, but it didn't in any way speak to me. And where I always, when I listened particularly to early German electronic music of various types, what it sounded like was, despite the fact that they were using very high-tech equipment, it still sounded like folk music in some way to me.
Yes, I think use the word anthemic when you're talking about American music, and I think there's a kind of an Emerson, Lake and Palmer about a lot of it. It's all, let's have a really raspy open fifths and make some big horn sounds and, hey, we're there. And, that vision in the mind's eye of three big semi-trucks kind of driving along with all the gear in the back is that's kind of the archetype of that big, technology-led American music scene. If I think of let's say the German scene, I think of the likes of, on the electronica side, the Tangerine Dreams and so on. On the prog rock side, the like of Schickfers and Frohling, who do this really delicate, melancholy, mellotron guitar stuff. And there's something about, you hear that and you can kind of get the sense that, this is a country one of whose major cities has a big wall down the middle so people can't get out. There's some kind of resonance there.
Right, that cause.
I hear that in the music.
Right. So now, in addition to sort of like your engagement with electronic music, one of the other things that I know of from your work is your work with dance companies or dancers and choreographers, and that's something that obviously still continues in your work. But you were one of the first people I knew of that was doing sort of like interactive, performative systems, using computers, using generative concepts. You were one of the first people I knew that was doing that, sort of like, or I'll say it this way: you were one of the first people that I knew that was doing that I knew personally, and it was really intriguing to me because, let's face it, dancers tend to be very beautiful people and tend to move beautifully, and it's a really engaging thing. And so there's some interest there, yay. But what I'm wondering is, how did you first get into it? And what is sort of like your take? How do you approach working with dancers that is different from, say, working with musicians or doing your own thing in the back bedroom?
Oh, let's see. There's about 6 questions there I can answer. Let's see how.
Yeah, I know. I'm just kind of pitching you a big one.
Okay, let's see. First off, I guess going back to a comment about algorithmic generative music systems. I'm a computer scientist. I had my PhD in that before I really started making music, so that's completely natural. The way I think about building music systems is purely in terms of building systems or engines or generative things that make the sound, because that's much easier than actually trying to write notes on a page. But maybe we'll come back to that. Let's get to the dancers thing. I guess, having done a couple of electronica gigs way back when, it just seemed clear to me now, as is painfully clear these days, that doing electronica when you haven't got racks and racks of flashy lights behind you is not terribly interesting. And when I was going on stage with the early Mac and the early MacBooks, PowerBooks as was then, it's not terribly interesting to look at for an audience. So I was trying to think, how do we actually make this into a full experience for people who are coming to see the music live rather than listen to it, at home with a pair of headphones. And about the same time, I got hooked on stuff that's happening in small theatres up in Edinburgh and in Glasgow. Glasgow just had its City of Culture award then, so there's lots of really interesting kind of left-wing leaning physical theatre performance going on there. And then I saw some dance work by a British choreographer named Rosemary Butcher, and I was absolutely immediately hooked on it because her stuff is very minimal, very architectural, very mathematical.
What was that name again? That it kind of glitched right when you said that name.
Rosemary Butcher.
Oh, okay.
Who's kind of seen as kind of one of the leading lights of what's now called the postmodern dance movement, whatever that means, because postmodern means whatever anybody wants to mean.
Right.
And her work was just beautifully clean, simple, very architectural. It was often site-specific. It would be in old warehouses or galleries. And yes, I was just hooked on that as an art form because it is both has an aesthetic purity to it, and it appeals in terms of systems because choreographers work in terms of systems and generative, making their work generatively and algorithmically, much as I was doing. And it was something that's extremely physical. When you see people on the stage and they're sweating and they're putting effort into it to actually create a system which you can then empathize with emotionally, then that's a win. And I just found that when I was watching this stuff, I could hear the kind of sound it needed in my head. So I thought, we've got to give that a try. And it just kind of went on from there. And of course, what happened since over the last few years is that now there's this whole dance technology movement that seems to have got to be a massive thing because the technology is now sufficiently cheap that anybody can buy it. And when I was working with dancers, there was no real dance technology. There was dances, choreography, and there was the kind of technology music side. And I kind of hung on there by the skin of my teeth and by my fingernails until the whole the disparate scenes kind of merged.
Right. Well,
it's that scene.
I've kind of gotten swept into that too. Now I'm working with the dance company, and it's really fantastic. But yeah, it's like viable because whether you're talking about sensors or cameras or whatever, it's sort of affordable. But I got swept in because someone saw that I was doing sort of like visual work and audio work and said, "Hey, kid, come over here." Kid, listen to me talk. Hey, guy, come over here and work with us, right? And because I didn't say no, good enough, right? But how did you get the first gig? I mean, did you just call up a dancer and say, "Hey, let's go"? I mean, how did you get that first gig? Because back then, it's not like people had it in their vision that this was going to be a common thing.
I think it's all about kind of trading karma. I got my first gig because I asked a lot of choreographers up in Scotland, "Hey, do you want to come perform in a piece I'm putting on for this small festival in Edinburgh and not get paid for it?" And that's the kind of question you can ask once, I did that. because I didn't know any better. It was my first time.
Right.
And, I kind of pulled it off by the skin of my teeth, got some good reviews in the national press in Scotland. And by that time I was hooked on it, but it all kind of went a bit fallow and finally decided, no, time to move to London because that's where all the big institutions are. And, in the UK, London is where the stuff happens. And once I moved down here, within a year or two, I was doing work out at Ballet Frankfurt, which was William Forsythe's company at the time, the big German contemporary ballet company.
Right.
And things kind of slowly started building from there. Because I guess what I was doing was sufficiently unusual that it needed to be in a big city where there's enough of a kind of a critical mass of people work at a level where they could kind of make these connections and make things happen and experiment to that degree.
Do you think, though, that you would have had you would have had sort of like the first shot success if you had started in London? I mean, it sounds to me like there's value in saying, well, I was working in Scotland and I did a little thing and I got national press. Isn't that harder to do if you're in a bigger environment like London?
I don't know. There's something to be said for going somewhere small and making all the mistakes first, and then kind of moving to a second place and saying, okay, now I know what mistakes not to make. On the other hand, London has lots of scenes here. There's lots of small subgenres and little communities going on. And London's sufficiently big that you can have like 5 communities all doing experimental hackspace bass electronic music who never talk to one another. It really is quite astonishing.
Right.
We've got 8 million people, so that kind of stuff happens.
Well, and those people tend to not want to speak to each other anyway, so there you go.
I do my best to try and bash some heads together.
I know, I was
just happen. So I don't know. I guess I would probably have, hopefully finally got to this stage, no matter where I was. But certainly you've got to assume you're going to make some mistakes along the way and kind of choose the best place to make those mistakes such that it doesn't kind of, drag you back once you get your head sorted out.
Right. So when you talk about building systems for dancers or choreographers, what do those systems look like? Are you primarily doing systems, music and feedback systems? Are you doing visual systems? Are you doing something else?
Well, I guess the best thing about this job, if I can call it a job, is that everything's different. Every collaboration is different. So even the choice of tools varies wildly. So, for example, the piece we did for Wayne McGregor, which went to the Wellcome Trust, and which he used in the studio making his last piece, Settled as Wells, that was all based around open source software, something called Field by the Open-Ended Group. I did some work with them on that. And that was all visuals based in 3D, and I did a whole bunch of web front end for that. The most recent sound project I did for Shobna Jayasingh was all Ableton Live and Maxwell Live, because it was fairly clear that we wanted something that was kind of slightly linear, or had a linear kind of overall structure, but was also very algorithmic. I'm kind of not answering your question here. I'm kind of heading off on a tangent, but stay with me on this one for 5 minutes at least. I think one thing I tend not to do, actually, despite saying I'm a technologist who does these kind of collaborations, is I tend not to do a lot of work with sensing systems unless I've got a lot of control over how they're going to work and how precise they're going to be. In the same way as I kind of gave up on applied maths because it was too kind of messy compared to the lovely, pristine, pure stuff.
Right.
I tend not to work with things like video processing systems or sound processing systems that use sound in the space if what comes out is really kind of messy and needs to be cleaned up, partly because you kind of lose sight of the process, you lose sight of the mathematics. And I like working with choreographers who think mathematically in the first instance, so we can talk about generative systems and recursive systems at the same kind of level. And secondly, I tend not to do lots of work in video because then there's always a risk that the medium becomes the process or the medium becomes the piece. And I really have very little patience for getting into that kind of world where you're judged on what equipment you're using and what you're doing with it, rather than on what process you've got behind trying to construct the piece and how you're using that process to elicit an emotional response. So there, I've completely not answered your question. Does that help?
No, but it's actually a really good point, because especially since you say that you're taking this mathematical approach, my question when working with dancers or other performers is, how do you how do you do the work in a way that doesn't make it so that your mathematics are the piece and the dancers are just sort of like a corollary moving part behind it? I always struggle, and I work really hard to make sure that whatever I do is augmenting dancers rather than dancers augmenting my great idea.
Yeah, the important part of that equation then is the choreographer, finding choreographers who are strong and highly skilled and can work really good craft. So, for example, when I work with Shobna Jayasingh, she's an extremely experienced and proficient choreographer. She makes really, really beautiful, highly crafted work. And she works with systems. She works with language. She works with words. She knows how to take pieces of choreographic material and then transform in various ways, which are essentially mathematical. She builds generative systems in her head. She puts those systems into the dancers and then has them essentially work to manifest the material. And that's exactly the way I think about making sound and visuals from a computer science background. So, when the collaboration is at that level, we are both thinking in terms of systems and algorithms and shapes and architectures. And that's what really gels. And that's where the creativity comes from, because we're both kind of plowing that furrow, as it were. Right.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the most interesting experiences that I had with a dance company was doing some work. I went to a rehearsal, saw some of the early work they were doing. I came up with some material that I thought would work very well for them in the direction they were going. I brought it in, and like before my eyes, I saw them, again, working with a strong choreographer, I saw them sort of like transform their work to sort of like, first of all, integrate with it, and then sort of like co-opt it so that they were in control. It was amazing. I assumed that it was great work on the choreographer's part. Maybe it was something else, but I'm pretty sure it was the choreographer. I mean, do you have that experience often where you come in with some portion of a system and they look at it, they know the system that they're working with, and the next thing you know, the whole thing's been transformed? And then how much do you end up having to manipulate your work once you initially show it off?
Well, I guess I go through that kind of experience often enough to keep doing it, because when it happens, it's utterly wonderful. When you can take something you built and really kind of take it to the next level.
Right.
And really kind of manifest it in a way that you hadn't expected. What happens more often is that I'll come up with some really great ideas for something, and maybe 25% of it will work, and the rest, even though it's something I'm essentially proud of or quite attached to, is just kind of not going to do the job. And you have to get used to the fact that you have to throw stuff away, or at least shelve it, and be able to turn on a dime, be able to work really quickly. So the two sound projects I've done with Shobana, I've come in with ideas that I've liked and immediately just realised that, okay, this one, and this one, just not going to work. It's just nothing to do with the piece. The dancers cannot work with it because the edge is wrong. And the process I've used to build it is such that it's not flexible in the right sort of way. And I guess it's similar to kind of doing a software project. You build code to try and solve a problem, and then realize that, actually the problem's more complicated than that, or actually it's not really, I don't really need these kind of structures. I'm trying to solve a different kind of problem here, and I can do it better this way. So let's just throw this code away and actually do it again. And that works in these kind of collaborations as well. So you have to stay agile, be able to fix things quickly, come in with lots of ideas and prepared to throw most of them away, and then have enough intuition that you can just say, right, this is the one that's working. Trust me, I know this is going to work because it just feels like it's going in the right direction. And then be able to kind of mutate and expand it from there.
So you just kind of threw out the number of 25%, but do you feel like it's literally that kind of percentage? And how do you deal with sort of like the emotional drain of saying, especially if it's something that you really liked when you were putting it together, and then you see it in place, or you talk to the choreographer and you realize that it's just not going to happen and it needs to get tossed in the bucket? Have you been doing this long enough that you just don't get emotionally attached to those things, or do you still find yourself kind of regretting having to put something away?
Well, I think to an extent those are the kind of issues that you face even if you're working solo. If you just try to put together the next album, then you get to a situation where there are things that you're fond of or things you're invested in that don't work in the context of what you're trying to produce, and you have to throw them away. So there's nothing really about collaborating with choreographers that makes that any different.
Well, except that it's somebody else helping to make that determination too. I mean,
you have to get over that. Yes, you have to get over the fact that people could say, that's not working. Can you do something else? On the other hand, they're in the same situation. They're trying to build material as well. And, if you just feel like you've run out of ideas, then you just watch what they're doing for 5 minutes and go, I've got a new idea. Hang on, I just thought of something, just based on what you just did there. So whilst this is it's kind of a cruel crucible of ideas, things get killed off pretty quickly. But on the other hand, there's lots of new things all being generated at the same time. So you've just got to really kind of just ride that one and use intuition to pick the ones that you think are going to work.
Right. Now, I can imagine that kind of collaborative action happening with small companies or smaller groups, but how do you deal with that kind of collaborative stuff when you're working with something as huge as Ballet Frankfurt or some of these other larger companies?
They tend to work in the same kind of way, because even a large company, certainly in the contemporary dance world, will be no more than maybe a dozen dancers, and there'll be a choreographer and maybe a dramaturge helping out with the kind of the overall shape of the piece. So it's the same kind of hierarchy and the same kind of creative process going on. There's somebody who's kind of directing and causing material to be made and kind of shaping and working that. So yeah, it's the same kind of level of collaboration. You've got somebody in charge of what's being seen, and somebody in charge of what's being heard, and the two creative processes kind of pushing on in parallel.
Sure. Have you ever worked with like the opposite, like extremely small things, like maybe even a single person who is a combination choreographer dancer? Have you worked at that level?
I've done quite a few of those over the years. That I find there's some pitfalls in that. One pitfall is when you work with a person who's both the choreographer and the dancer, then they tend to be making pieces that are extremely personal, and it becomes hard to kind of distance from kind of the emotional content. So there has to be somebody you know really well, I think, to be able to pull that off. Otherwise, you're spending all your time trying to learn what it is that makes them tick. When you're working with a choreographer who has dancers, then you're not kind of tied into that very kind of emotional, personal connection. You're working with material that's kind of outside all the people involved, if that makes sense.
It does. I've never worked with a single person, and I can imagine the difficulties in going through a critique process with because like you say, it's such a personal process.
Well, it's like being an instrumentalist working with a vocalist for the first time. I'm sure it's very similar, because vocal work is very personal in the same kind of way.
Yeah, especially like songwriting vocalists, right? Now,
exactly.
when you're doing these systems-based collaborations, whether it's with dancers or in other performance contexts, what kind of environment do you set up for yourself for performing? I mean, do you just use like the mouse pad and a custom UI? Do you use a lot of controllers? I mean, I know from talking with you and from reading your work on Sound and Sound, you kind of like have your arms around a lot of controllers. But you, for your own personal use, do you use controller systems?
I will tend to kind of pick something more or less at random project, just based on some kind of intuition about what I'll need. So it'll be anything from a generic fader box to maybe one of the mono marks or one of the mono grids, because it's very hard to tell when you're starting out how much of the making process is about making the material and how much is about making the way that you control it. And I guess you must find the same when you're working with a modular synth, because you're constantly working both in terms of making a material on it and also in terms of freeing up the things you can control about it. And that doesn't become clear really until you're kind of part way into the process, when you realize, actually, this bit we're going to set because it has to be the right length and it has to kind of have this shape. But this bit here we want to keep open and flexible because we're not quite sure how that fits in. So therefore, I will use, this fader box here to control that because it's the right kind of thing. And that process is ongoing. So I'll start with one controller, then I will set the material, then pick some other controller that's completely different because I suddenly want to work with something kind of gestural to shape some other part of the material.
Right, but it's interesting that you bring up the modular synth thing, because in fact, whether you're working with a modular or whether you're working with controllers, there's always this other thing, which is you can get so wrapped up in the development of the controller gesture that you forget that there's actual material that you're creating.
Yep, that's always the risk. And, I solved that one by having a stopwatch that goes for an hour, then goes ding and says, Nick, stop it, you're just messing about again. Just stop making material. It requires a bit of kind of time discipline, I think.
I mean, it takes a certain discipline not to do that. It takes discipline to even set an alarm clock, and I'm not sure that I have even that level of discipline. So talking about controllers, and let's talk in specific. You mentioned the Monome, both the grid and the arc. Let's talk about grid controllers right now, because it seems like grid controllers are sort of raining from the sky at this point. There are a lot of different people doing them. They're doing them in a variety of different ways, and a lot of them are interesting, and some of them are curious or even of questionable value. I hate to say it that way, but because maybe I look at something and I don't particularly grok how it would work. I mean, first of all, do you have like a personal favorite, or would you rather not say?
Let's see. I guess my personal favorite right at this moment, if we leave aside the ones I've got sitting here which haven't been reviewed yet, from the Monome side, I like the grayscale, because it's just a black, it's black on the sides, it's silver on top, and it lights a bit white. There's something about that monochromaticness that I find really appealing. It's just very, very minimal.
Right, we're talking about the Monome grayscale.
Yeah, the 64, the 8x8 box. There's something about that visual simplicity which I think elicits a kind of creative way of thinking about what you're making. Because as we know, if you're trying to be creative, then complexity distraction is the actual enemy of that. So you want something that's simple. Right. I think that's why the Mono has done so well when all these kind of RGB controllers have done less well, because they're just, doing too much and they haven't got that kind of focus and that craft.
Right.
So I guess my first go-to grid controller would be the grayscale 8x8. Second one, possibly innovation, the new Launchpad Mini is really, really neat. It's like the Launchpad, but they made it the right size. You can hold it in your hands. You can hit all the keys with two thumbs, and that's a really neat piece of kit.
I haven't seen one of those in person yet. I'm anxious to try it out.
Yeah, they've kind of got that right. The original Launchpad was too big and too slow. Right. The Launchpad S performed well, looked good, but was still a bit too big. That's also my problem, I guess, with the Ableton Push. It's a bit of a monster. It's great if you're happy to carry it around with you and have your entire desk space taken up with it, but you're kind of committing a lot of your creative headspace to it because it's filling your field of vision.
It's physically large, yeah.
So I tend to go for kind of lots of smaller controllers. I've got a Midifier sitting here. I'm going to play with it for the next week or two as well, because it's that kind of small, crafted, very specialized, pared down interface. It does a very few things, and it does them hopefully quite well.
Right. Now, do you find that the sort of like grid orientation and grid shape actually modifies the way that you develop things, or do you think it in any way limits your development because of having to fit everything into a grid style interface?
I think one of the dangers of the grid is that, the reason there's so many around is because Ableton Live Session View is a grid, right? And
right.
Everybody in their DJ younger brother wants to do clips. So I think it's kind of hard to pull away from that and say, right, I don't think want something that's just there for clip triggering. So how do I make that into some sort of musical system? And I guess I fall back to my comfort zone, which is I start coding. I start writing little sequencey things that I can kind of map onto a grid such that they will do stuff that's interesting, slightly unpredictable, and will hopefully be surprising in interesting, creative ways.
Right.
Which sounds like a partial answer to your question. I'm not quite sure I have a full answer to it.
Well, to a certain extent, it was kind of a dorky question because, nobody wants to say, yeah, I'm limited by the shape of a grid. And conversely, nobody even knows if they are until they're actually talking about a specific project. I don't think that maybe it was a very good question because I don't think that there's a general case answer for that. So, sorry about that.
But we can generalize about whether being limited is a good thing or a bad thing. Having no limits at all, I think, is bad because frame on your canvas, then where do you start painting?
I agree with that. Now, one of the things, since we've talked about the monome, it actually makes me want to ask another question because it seems on the surface to be related, although my suspicion is that it is not. You're involved in something called Monomatic.
Yes.
And I looked at your website, Casile.com, and one of the first images that comes up is a thing that really sort of like have that kind of minimalist look and interface to them, but are clearly not monome devices. So my first indication would be, it's sort of like building off the work. But then when I went and looked at what Monomatic is actually doing, you guys are flying all over the map. Well, can you tell us a little bit about Monomatic and what the goals are there?
Monomatic is a kind of a case study in how not to set goals because you'll end up doing something completely different. We started out, that was myself and Lewis Sykes, my colleague who's based in Manchester, and our plan for Monomatic was we wanted to do things like, Giorgio Moroder disco hits, but use monomes to control them and go out gigging and doing some AV gigs. And that never happened. What happened after that was a few months later we landed a big commission to build a audiovisual installation piece for Sound and Music Expo, which is a big sound art, a national sound art festival. And we built this laser-controlled, Arduino-powered church bell tower. It was essentially real size, so it was about 2 meters across, with these laser-triggered bell ringing columns, and the thing had RGB LEDs behind it, so it would actually show the bells being struck. We went up church towers, and we've had a recording session with BBC engineers recording the bells. We had down projection built by a colleague of ours called Dan Jones. He'd had this big processing-based animation that showed all the pealing patterns, the way he actually rang out bell peals. So we had this massive project that pretty much killed the two of us, just in terms of the sheer effort and the stress. And then from that, we went on, decided we all do something that doesn't require a transit van to move around. So we came up with this idea of this tiny musical box, which I think is the thing that, from how you described it, sounds like the one you're talking about, which is a thing built out of what look like monome-sized boxes. And it's kind of a combination between a Victorian musical box, the ones with a little ballerina that spins around on top, and a vinyl record player. So you put these acrylic sheets onto the thing. The acrylic is a disc about 12 inches across.
Right.
And that has little magnets inside it, and the magnets trigger sensors that actually trigger the notes. So it's like a player piano, but with the score arranged in a circle, set into a 12-inch plastic disc. And you can replace the discs and you get different tunes coming out of it.
So you've made sort of like the modern Optagon.
Yes, pretty much, yes.
Well, that's it's crazy for me to hear that actually started up as the potential for a performing group, and you've become a technology group.
What I'm finding now is that there's much more work out there doing installation works and making pieces and doing visuals than there is actually playing music. That just seems to be kind of the way the wind is blowing at the moment.
It does seem that way. There are very few times, if you're doing technology, there are very few times that people say that you have to pay in order to show your work. So,
yeah.
Where for music, that's getting to be more and more common. This idea of a music box is actually, it resonates with me. I'm actually, and I think it resonates with a lot of people because I've been working on a project with somebody to do sort of a music box like thing, and in doing that, that's put me in contact with other people. What do you think is the resonance behind music boxes, and why it is that there's sort of a gravitational pull towards that?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you if that's the case. It's the first I've heard that there's actually more than one person wanting to actually build something like this. But
really?
I guess...
Well, I don't think anybody's doing records for it, but the idea of having a box that creates music rather than a person is something that I've been hearing a lot about lately.
Right, I guess there's also some ties with the whole kind of 3D printing world as well. Right, people printing new discs for existing machines and so on. I guess it's a mix of things. It's the appeal of physical devices making sound. And there's a big push in that at the moment. People turning out little electronic bleepy boxes and things. partly exploring step sequencing, because that seems to be a big thing now again for the nth time.
Right.
And I guess if you combine things that can do step sequencing with things that are physical in nature and make something circular, then what you get is a music box. That's kind of the thing that comes out the other end.
Right. I had never really thought about what a music box was doing as sort of like idiosyncratic step sequencing, but that, of course, is exactly what it is. The other thing I wonder is if there isn't something, I'm not sure if it's like sort of like hearkening back to mothers and, their little special place for stuff, or if it's just kind of looking back to old school technology with a warm place in our heart, some sort of like weird nostalgia. But it does seem to be a thing, and maybe I've just talked to the right three people. I don't know.
Oh, maybe it's a hipster thing. We're all kind of growing beards and smoking pipes and wearing tweeds, and go back a few more decades, and it's into music boxes and all the Victoriana. Steampunk comes around again.
Yeah, steampunk comes around again. Right, exactly. I don't even want to talk about smoking a pipe and wearing a ponytail and tweed. That scares me. Well, Nick, thank you so much. I can't believe I've got this list of stuff I was going to talk to you about. We didn't even talk about closure at all, which is pretty amazing.
Man.
But the fact of the matter is, I have always been curious about some of your background and some of the way that you approach your work, and this was a great opportunity to kind of learn more about that. I really appreciate your time. We look forward to seeing more of your work, whether it's your own work with different dance companies, with the Monomatic thing, whatever. Do whatever you can to keep us informed, because I think you're doing some fascinating work.
Most kind. Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks a lot, Nick.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Cheers.
Another great interview by another great artist. I want to thank everyone who's been listening, and please tell your friends. I'd like a lot more people to listen to this if possible. If you have ideas for people to interview, or if you'd like to be interviewed yourself, make sure to drop me a line at ddg@cycling74.com. Until next week, see ya.